The rain had started to fall lightly when Henry first saw the deck of cards at the estate sale. It was an old weather-beaten pack with a peculiar design, mountain peaks drawn in silver foil, jagged and gleaming under the dim light of the garage. Henry wasn't a collector by any means, but something about the deck called to him. It was tucked away in a dusty corner beside a broken clock and an odd assortment of brass trinkets. There was no price tag, just a faint, almost invisible inscription. For the player who dares. Henry stared at it, feeling a strange pull. The estate sale was almost over, and the seller seemed more than happy to part with their belongings. He handed them a few tarnished coins and pocketed the cards, trying to ignore the sudden knot that twisted in his stomach. Later that night, in the dim apartment, Henry sat at the table with the deck. His life had been unraveling for months. A dead-end job, mounting bills, and a string of failed relationships. Desperation clung to him like a shadow. He shuffled the cards absent-mindedly, but as he did, something strange happened. They felt heavier than they should have, weighted with an invisible force. There was a whisper in the back of his mind, faint but persistent. He pulled the first card from the deck. It was blank. At least it seemed that way at first. Then, as he stared at it, faint letters began to emerge, like ink seeping through the card surface. The choice is yours. Before Henry could process it, the phone rang. It was Alice, an old friend he hadn't spoken to in years. They had grown apart after college, their lives diverging into separate, unrecognizable paths. She had always been the lucky one, it seemed. After they graduated, her life took off. Dream job, beautiful home, success that seemed to come effortlessly. Henry? Alice's voice was tight and urgent. I need to see you. Tonight. They met in a small cafe, the rain now pouring in sheets outside. Alice looked uneasy, her normally composed face lined with something deeper, something hidden beneath her usual cool demeanor. I heard you found a deck of cards, she said, her voice almost drowned by the noise of the rain. Henry blinked. He hadn't mentioned the cards to anyone. How did you know? Because I've been playing Mountain for years, she whispered, leaning closer. It's why I'm here today. The game, it's real, Henry, and it's dangerous. Confusion washed over him. Mountain? What the hell are you talking about? Alice sighed, running a hand through her damp hair. It's not just a game. No one knows who truly created it, but there are rumors. Rumors that it was made for Fate's amusement. It was created to balance the scales, to give those who were desperate a chance, and to teach others harsh lessons. Every full moon, coordinates are broadcast on old radios, on static-ridden TV channels. If you know what you're looking for, you'll hear them. If you don't even notice. Henry stared at her, trying to comprehend what she was saying. It sounded insane, yet something about it felt eerily familiar, like a truth he had always known but had never acknowledged. There are rules, Alice continued. The coordinates lead to a location, and the first three people who arrive have a choice. They can take a single card from the deck at the site, or they can choose to stay and play. You take the card and leave, no harm can come to you for 48 hours. People have used those 48 hours to do unimaginable things, Henry. Crimes, risks, because they know they can't be stopped. Henry's pulse quickened. And if you stay? Alice's eyes darkened. Then you play the game. The stakes are high. You can only play with another player, or with fate itself. Each player reveals a card from their deck, and whatever happens in the game happens in real life. Some cards can grant power, wealth, even life itself. But there are darker cards too. Fear, death, madness. You don't get to choose your fate once the game begins. Henry's mind spun as Alice continued, her voice low and urgent. I was like you once, desperate, and I found my first deck at an auction just like you. I decoded the coordinates, played the game, and my life changed, but not without a cost. I played against a woman, desperate like me, and we both drew life cards. Our lives improved beyond anything we imagined, but I've seen people who weren't so lucky. Alice took a shaky breath, her hands trembling slightly. There was a man. He played the death card against someone who drew the loop. He thought he could walk away, that he could control the outcome. But he didn't realize the loop repeats whatever effects is in play. He didn't just die. He's still dying endlessly, screaming, trapped in some kind of eternal torment. His body, it never stays dead, but his mind, his mind is gone. Henry felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. So, what do I do? What if I don't want to play? Alice met his gaze, her expression haunted. You don't have a choice anymore, Henry. Once you touch the cards, once you shuffle the deck, you part of the game. Whether you play or not, Mountain will find you. Here are the rules. Number 1. Decks and cards have to be won from other players, found in hidden caches, or purchased from collectors. Theft has consequences. A deck needs a minimum of one card. The deck has no upper limit. However, just because a card is owned doesn't mean it has to be placed in the deck. When you touch the cards, you are obligated to play. Every full moon, there is an announcement to all players and potential players about caches of mounting cards that can be found. When you reach the cache, you have 3 options. Take one card and leave, challenge another player at the cache for the entire cache, or you can challenge fate for a gold card. All games play until a player is unable to play, surrenders, or runs out of cards. The loser of a game of Mountain leaves behind all cards they played during the game. The winner decides what to do with these cards. White card effects only apply to the player who plays it. Blue card effects only apply to the chosen player. Red card effects only apply to the opponent. Black card effects apply to all players of the game. Gold card effects endure after the game for as long as fate desires it. Player cards affect directly to another card, and that endures as long as the original card's effect. The exact effects of the cards depend on the player and the connection of the player to the card. And the final rule is to have fun. Days passed and Henry couldn't shake Alice's words. The cards sat on his table untouched, but he could feel them. They thrummed with an energy that was impossible to ignore. And then on the night of the next full moon, it happened. The radio crackled to life at exactly 12 a.m. At first it was just static, then the coordinates came, spoken in a low, distorted voice. They only repeated once, but somehow Henry knew them instantly. He scribbled them down on the back of a napkin, his hand shaking. He had a choice. He could ignore the game, throw the cards away and pretend none of it was real, or he could go to the coordinates and see for himself. Desperation made the decision for him. The location was a forgotten field on the outskirts of town. He arrived just before dawn, the grass wet with dew. 2 other people stood in the clearing, a man and a woman, both as tense and uneasy as Henry felt. They nodded to him but said nothing. It was clear they knew the rules. At the center of the field was a small wooden box, old and worn. with the same mountain insignia he had seen on his desk. The box was open, revealing a stack of cards inside. The man stepped forward first, choosing a card and slipping it into his pocket. The woman followed, her eyes never leaving the deck. Henry hesitated. He could take a card and leave, claim his 48 hours of safety, or he could stay and play. He reached for a card and his fingers brushed the deck. He felt the weight of the choice. He drew the Fool. The card shimmered in his hand, its meaning obscured, but he felt a strange sense of power wash over him. He was about to leave when the woman spoke. "I'm staying. I'm playing." Henry's heart pounded. Fate had dealt its hand. Henry's pulse raced as he stared at the woman. Her face was expressionless, but her eyes held a sharp, calculating glint. She had made her choice. The tension in the air thickened as if the clearing itself was holding its breath, waiting for the game to begin. He felt the weight of the deck in his pocket and knew that there was no turning back now. "Your move," the woman said, her voice low, almost a whisper. She produced her own deck of cards, worn and stained from use, and shuffled it with a kind of practiced ease that made Henry's stomach churn. The rules had been drilled into him by Alice. Each player reveals one card at a time. The game continues until either player has no cards left to play, or until one is too broken by the consequences to continue. Henry took a deep breath and he pulled his first card and played it. Hope. As soon as he revealed it, a faint glow surrounded the white card. The air shifted, growing warmer, and he felt something inside him strengthen, a tiny flicker of optimism. He was still terrified, but a part of him believed that maybe, just maybe, he could come out of this unscathed. The woman didn't flinch. She smiled, a small, cold thing that didn't reach her eyes. Then she flipped her own blue card. Despair. The moment her card hit the air, the world around them darkened. The sky, once faintly lit by the coming dawn, seemed to lose its color. Shadows lengthened and a heavy weight pressed down onto Henry's chest. He could feel it, deep inside, an overwhelming sense of hopelessness that tried to snuff out the flicker of light his card had created. Hope and despair clashed, but neither card won. They balanced each other out, leaving the game's outcome still uncertain. Henry swallowed hard. The warmth he'd felt was already slipping away. She watched him closely, her fingers resting on her deck as though she already knew what she'd play next. Henry didn't wait. He drew again. Desire. The card hummed with energy, its edges glowing faintly red. The moment he revealed it, he felt an overwhelming surge of want, desire for success, for a better life, for something greater than the miserable existence he'd been living. There wasn't just his desire. He could feel it radiating outward, affecting both of them. The woman's eyes flashed, and for a brief moment he saw something raw and vulnerable in her expression. She was vulnerable to this card too. He made a mental note of this. But she regained control quickly. With a deliberate, almost cruel smile, she revealed her next red card. Envy. The impact was immediate. A cold wind whipped through the clearing, and Henry felt an ugly, gnawing sensation build in his chest. His mind was flooded with bitter, jealous thoughts. Why hadn't he been as successful as Alice? Why did other people seem to glide through life, untouched by failure, while he struggled? He glanced at the woman, and for a moment he could see she felt the same. Envy poisoned them both, magnified by the desire card Henry had played. The cards intertwined in a strange, grotesque dance, each feeding off each other. Desire intensified envy, and envy twisted desire into something dark and consuming. Henry's hands shook as he drew his next card, fighting against the emotions that surged inside him. He drew the black card, Compassion. The moment he revealed it, the oppressive feeling of envy began to lessen. Compassion radiated from the card like a balm, soothing the jagged edges of desire and jealousy. The envy that had threatened to tear them both apart eased, replaced by a soft warmth. Henry could feel it even in the woman, though she resisted. Her lips tightened, but her hand hovered over her deck. She was calculating, measuring him. Without hesitation, she played her next blue card, Betrayal. The air grew sharp and cold, and Henry felt a stab of pain in his chest, an emotional wound so deep that it took his breath away. He could feel every betrayal he'd ever experienced come rushing back to him. Friends who had abandoned him, lovers who had lied, promises broken. But this time the card didn't just affect him, he could feel it wrap around the woman as well. A double-edged blade. She winced, but her resolve didn't falter. The betrayal card amplified every doubt he had, turning his compassion into something vulnerable. It tried to make him weak, tried to erode his resolve. But Henry refused to give in. He could retaliate, play something dark from his deck, something that would hurt her the way her cards were hurting him. He knew he had cards capable of that. He could feel them at the edge of his consciousness, whispering promises of vengeance and pain. But that wasn't who he was. Instead, Henry drew his next black card, Forgiveness. The card glowed with a soft, gentle light. As it hit the air, the sharp sting of betrayal dulled. He felt a strange peace settle over him, a release from the wounds that had been reopened. The bitterness and anger that betrayal had brought to the surface slowly began to dissolve. The woman's expression shifted, a flicker of something uncertain, maybe even fear, crossing her face. She hadn't expected him to play a card like forgiveness. In this game, players often fought to tear each other down, to outdo one another with cruelty and power. But Henry was playing a different game, and she didn't know how to respond. For a moment they stood in silence, the clearing still and heavy with the tension of the game. Henry could see her hesitating, her hand trembling over her deck. She could play another cruel card, something that could hurt him, break him down, or she could try something else. She drew her clear card, Deception, and he played it over Henry's forgiveness, making it so his forgiveness would always end in deception. The card was dark, its energy sharp and cutting. As soon as it hit the air, Henry could feel its warping reality. The ground beneath them seemed to shift, and he felt disoriented, unsure of what was real and what was false. The woman's face blurred, twisting into something he couldn't recognize. He heard voices, whispers that weren't his own, murmurs of lies and falsehood. But through the haze of deception, Henry held fast. He knew what his next card would be. His hand steadied as he pulled from his deck, revealing the white card, Truth. The card cut through the deception like a blade, its light pure and unwavering. The whispers fell silent, the ground stabilized, the woman's face snapped back into focus. The illusion she had tried to create crumbled before them, leaving only the stark reality of the game. The woman took a step back, her confidence faltering. She had played her darkest cards, hoping to break him, But Henry had met every move with something stronger, something kinder. "I don't have to hurt you," Henry said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling around them. "You don't have to hurt me either." For the first time since the game had begun, the woman's eyes softened. She looked at the cards in her hand, at the game they had been playing, and for a moment she seemed lost. But then she shook her head, her expression hardening once more. She drew her final card, a red card called Oblivion. The moment she played it, the world darkened again, but this time it was different. The edges of the clearing seemed to fray, unraveling like loose threads. Henry could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, an emptiness that threatened to consume everything, to erase them both. But Henry wasn't afraid. He drew his last card, a blue card called Grace. It was a card unlike any he had played before, and as soon as it touched the air, the darkness of oblivion stopped. The unraveling threads of the world began to weave themselves back together. The light from the card expanded, filling the clearing with a soft, radiant glow. The game was over. The woman stood there, staring at the cards, her face unreadable. The weight of the game, of the choices they had made, hung between them. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving Henry standing alone in the clearing. The deck in his hand felt lighter now, as if the cards themselves had changed somehow. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Henry understood. The game of Mountain wasn't about winning or losing. It was about the choices you made, the kind of person you chose to be. And Henry had chosen to stay true to himself, even when the cards were stacked against him. As the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, Henry stood still in the clearing, his heart still racing, his breath slow and deliberate. The game was over, but the weight of it still pressed on his chest. His eyes drifted to the ground where the cards lay scattered, both his and the woman's, glinting faintly in the weak light. He knelt down, his fingers brushing against the first card he had played. Hope. The card still radiated a faint warmth, though it felt different. Heavier. Not in weight, but in meaning. He picked it up, turning it over in his hand. The surface of the card seemed to shimmer for a moment, like it held all the possibilities that had once existed during the game. He slipped it back into his deck, feeling the burden of the choice he had made to play it. The choice that had set the tone for the entire game. Next he picked up Compassion, its edges soft and glowing. This card had been his shield against the darkness, a light in the midst of the cruel blows the woman had tried to deliver. As he held it, the memory of the moment and it had turned the tide for him came rushing back. How it softened the blow of betrayal, how it kept him anchored to his principles. He could feel the weight of it now, not as a burden, but as a reminder of who he was. He tucked it into his deck with a deep breath. Nearby lay the woman's cards, discarded and twisted by the forces of the game. Henry hesitated for a moment before reaching for them. Her deck, too, was part of the story now. The first was Despair. As his hand touched it, a chill ran through him. This card had tried to drag him into the darkness, had tried to break his spirit, and yet in his hands now it felt different, lighter almost. He had overcome it. The black tendrils of its influence no longer reached for him. He slipped it into his pocket, feeling its cold weight, but knowing it had no longer had power over him. He gathered her other cards, Envy and Betrayal, each one a bitter reminder of the dangers of the game. Each one still carried the echoes of the choices she had made. But even as he held them, Henry didn't feel anger or resentment. Instead, he felt a strange sense of understanding. These cards represented her struggles, her pain, her fears. They were part of her journey, just as his cards were part of his. He added them to his deck, feeling the balance shift between light and dark, hope and despair within the collection of the cards he now carried. At last his hand closed around Oblivion, the final card the woman had played. It was cold, darker than any of the others, and as he lifted it, the clearing around them seemed to quiet. This card had almost ended it all, had almost torn everything apart. The weight of it in his hand felt immense, heavier than all the others combined. He could still feel its power, the pull of its endless void. But grace had saved him from it, and now in his hands, Oblivion felt like just another card, stripped of its finality. He placed it into his deck with the others. As he stood, Henry's hand hovered over his deck, now heavier with the cards he had collected, both his and hers. He could feel the weight of the choices they represented, not just the ones made during the game, but the choices that brought them both to this moment. The deck in his hand was no longer just a collection of cards. It was a story, a journey of hope, fear, compassion, and darkness. And then as he straightened, he heard it, a whisper carried on the wind, barely audible, but unmistakable. We chose well. The words sent a shiver down his spine. Though they were not spoken with malice or cruelty, they carried a sense of finality, of judgment passed and a decision made. Fate had watched them, had judged them both, and had decided. The game had been more than just cards played. It had been a test, a lesson. Henry stood there for a long time, the whisper still echoing faintly in the back of his mind. The weight of the cards in his hand was palpable, each one a reminder of the game, of the choices he had made, and the lessons learned. He could feel the presence of the game, the unseen force that had guided him, tested him. Slowly Henry tucked the deck into his jacket pocket. The clearing was empty now, save for the faint echoes of what had transpired. He took a deep breath, the crisp morning air filling his lungs, and turned to leave. As he walked away, he felt a strange sense of peace. The game wasn't over, never truly was, but for now he had passed its test. He had chosen not to harm, not to retaliate with darkness, and Mountain had seen him for what he was. In the distance, the sun broke through the clouds, casting the first golden light over the horizon. Henry walked toward it, the deck of cards heavy in his pocket, but his heart lighter than it had been in years.